So my abstract dramatically overpromised on the breadth and depth of analysis I could fit into under 30 minutes. It will be under. So this is extremely broad brush. And I say that with one eye on my Aegean projects. Some of this is going to be really very sketchy. Rather than starting contextualization, I'm going to jump right in with digression, and we'll come back in a minute to a more traditional overview. So in the summer semester, I taught a class on writing practices in the Bronze Age Aegean. We worked our way through the Aegean practices, making and incising Cretan hieroglyphic and linear A ceilings and documents. And we finished with this linear B tablet, which is one of my favorites. It illustrates many of the characteristics of linear B administration. The text fits the tablet well, syllabograms and ideograms are clearly written, and it has a very orderly format. So the students took their clay, they shaped the tablets, and they started on the text. All of them in the same way, by incising the guidelines first, and then starting at the top and working down. Except for one student who incised just the ideograms, the pigs, down the right-hand side of the tablet. And I asked him what he was doing. He said the syllabograms were too difficult. He'd go back to them. But his pig signs were very beautifully written. And he observed that starting from the leftmost sign and working away towards the right, this line, if you can see over my head, is the last. And that's what makes it a pig. That final stroke becomes the blunt end of the pig's nose, and the sign comes alive. Now, at the time, I was very cross because I didn't think he was taking the exercise 100% seriously. But I kept coming back to it and wondering whether he did really write his pig ideograms, moving stroke by stroke, left to right, because he was thinking about imbuing the signs with pigness. Or because, as a product of Western alphabetic schooling, he couldn't think himself out of left to rightness, and the pig's noses were actually a kind of post-rationalization. So this has very much shaped my thinking for this paper. What choices do we make about writing direction, but also what kinds of stories do we tell ourselves to justify the choices? So that was the digression to the material now. Writing actually comes rather late to the Aegean, but the inhabitants make up for this by developing, using, and losing at least 3.5 scripts within under 1,000 years. It's roughly 600 years. And the archaeology of writing here is largely an archaeology of administration. We have no written literature, laws, no inscriptions on buildings, and there are only some very tiny glimpses of writing usage in the context of religious ritual, personal expression, or display. But you don't actually need writing to do administration, and seal use as part of managed storage, self and group identification is visible on mainland Greece, the Cyclades and Crete in the early Bronze Age. Something changes on Crete during the late pre-Palatial, and then we find a small number of seals with script signs. The Acarnus script, and this is my Hoffa script, because it's a very, very small corpus, and it is rapidly rolled over into Cretan hieroglyphic. Cretan hieroglyphic and linear A. Cretan hieroglyphic, not hieroglyphic, linear A, not that linear, are used alongside seals in writing assisted administration in the First Palace period. Both remain undiscovered. Their context of use is elite, where the central elite buildings are what are conventionally called houses. And I will use the word palace, but with misgivings, because at this point we don't know who or what is based in the buildings. Hieroglyphic seems to go out of use at some point during the Second Palace period. Linear A usage spreads both within and beyond Crete, and again in both palatial and non-palatial elite contexts. Things have been bubbling away on mainland Greece during this period, and by the late Bronze Age, we now have small states centered on palaces there as well, and a third script, Linear B, which is developed at Knossos on Crete and then soon introduced at mainland sites. Linear B records an early form of Greek. The script itself is developed out of Linear A, even though Linear A is not Greek, and at the same time it replaces Linear A. Then around 1100 BCE, there's a final series of destructions. The palaces are destroyed, Linear B with them, and Greece is once again conquered. So our archaeology of writing is also an archaeology of things being deliberately or accidentally set on fire. All of our surviving administrative documents were preserved completely randomly when the buildings containing them were burnt down. So this obviously has dramatic implications for numbers of things, but also for the essential randomness of our corpora. Fires, they preserve documents made of clay relatively well, although not perfectly. But they do not preserve parchment, papyrus, and so on. And while we do have evidence for the use of parchment with sealings in the Second Palace period, we can make no claims that perishable materials were used for administration beyond this little window. When we come to writing directionality, we say that Linear B is written left to right, Linear A mostly left to right, but with exceptions, and Cretan hieroglyphic, anything you like. And this is not wrong. I'm not going to try and challenge this. But with the exception of literature focusing on specific details of paleography or epigraphy, there's rarely further discussion of this as a feature. So by writing direction, I mean the laying out of the text across the document as a whole, and this encompasses both the writing and the reading. What is the axis of the text? Are its lines horizontal rows or vertical columns? How are lines positioned relative to each other? Sorry, wrong one. So above and below on a horizontal axis, or left and right on a vertical axis, and in which direction are individual lines written and read, starting from left or right, top or bottom. And it's worth adding in an extra level specific to our material and many others of different directionalities within a single sign. Obviously, when you read a syllabogram or an ideogram, you take the sign as a whole, but each is written with a succession of strokes, and each of these strokes has an internal directionality. So within a script's orthography, a sign can potentially have a top and a bottom, a left and a right. And this is, of course, one of the vital tools for studying scribal variation and identifying individuals within the corpus. If we look at a Linear A tablet, chosen purely because it's the first one in the corpus, we can see that there is a linear arrangement. But the syllabograms and the numerals are higgledy-piggledy. There's not a columnar structure, as we saw with our Linear B tablet, and this complicates things. Now, these two syllabograms up here form a word which we have proposed a translation for, a reading, so we can infer a left-right direction from these syllables. But otherwise in an undeciphered script, you can't key yourself in through the reading. I would point with this tablet to a material feature which suggests that the text runs top downwards, and that's all of the blank space at the bottom. Tablets are very rare in Cretan hieroglyphic. The corpus has 4, 2 of which are possibly linear A. But I'm showing you this example for completeness and to point out an additional complicating factor. The directional reading of this object as a whole has actually been set by the corpus editors. Base alpha, the one at the top, is chosen based on the initial publication. The tablet is then rolled backwards away from the editor to record each additional incised face. So analysing the baggage generated in the construction of corpora would be worth a conference in itself for many of us, I'm sure. And it's always important to recognise, as Philip said, the etic nature of our classifications, but also how they trap us in a particular way of encountering a document. So identifying that something is written left to right, top to bottom is just the beginning. And the next question is, of course, why? Then this is where it gets more interesting, but also more difficult, more messy. Writing direction can be a part of a script system. It will be its rules, but then you must ask, what shapes the rules? And is it possible to find a general answer, given that while left to right, top to bottom is the most frequent combination, writing systems of the world show tremendous variety. Individuals can master scripts with different directionalities, and scripts themselves can undergo changes in writing direction for socio-political reasons or driven by technology. When I started muddling my way through some neuroscience papers, I fully expected to find a neurological preference for a particular directionality. This does not seem to be the case. And if anyone knows of any research to the contrary, I would be very pleased to read it. The brain is obviously the driver of thought and movement. It's particularly relevant when studying first and early writing systems to think about how the brain makes use of the pre-existing areas for speech and for tool use, which are then sort of reworked to enable the cognitive processes and fine motor movements needed for writing. The brain's expression of handedness is a factor here. Left-right differences in the human central nervous system are visible as early as 4 weeks post-conception, which I find absolutely extraordinary, indicating that laterality is innate and pervasive. Handedness here is complementary role differentiation. One hand executes high-frequency tasks requiring finer temporal and spatial resolution. The other hand performs lower frequency or less complex tasks. But this is not a definition which is specific to writing. It's about tool use, which requires precision gripping and fine motor control. And cross-culturally, most activities people do with their hands are barely lateralized. But understanding the impact of handedness is problematic in the ancient world. We cannot easily evaluate whether the handedness of the writer has an impact on their fitness for the writing direction when we do not know to what extent the natural expression of handedness is permitted in that society. And this is a relatively recent example of forced handedness. I originally had a slide about cuneiform, but I thought that might be a bit tactless to pick on cuneiform. The Aegean Bronze Age, we lack any written references to the act of writing, and there are no depictions of people writing. I can say, though, in a completely unscientific way, that I am a left-hander and I can write all three Aegean scripts with my left hand, and I can produce something that is visually comparable. Now, I will come back shortly to the socio-cultural significance of handedness. But this is a good point to acknowledge how much of the research on the neuroscience of writing and handedness is weird. What is true for Western schooled alphabetic literacy is not guaranteed to generalize to the rest of the world or into the past. And this is something all of us have touched on in different ways. And I don't think, as a discipline, broadly speaking, we've quite yet had a reckoning with our own weirdness. So, in the absence of a clear neurological driver, we need other explanations. And I take as a very basic starting point that there are many ways to write in the world, now and in the past, which suggests that it is possible to choose a writing direction because it suits your purposes best and it works well enough for your writing community. So we can ask, where does the script system fit into its wider world of writing? And here's an example specific to the Aegean. Which components are inherited if there is a parent script which are developed afresh? Are there influences from elsewhere, adaptations and so on? How much is absorbed without questioning, and what is deliberately changed? When changes are made in orthography, can we discern a motivation or not? Similarly, what is the motivation for starting to use writing within that script community? And how does it affect the document shapes and the formats developed? And one can make the general but useful observation for first and early writing in the ancient Near East, Egypt and the Aegean, that they're put to purposes not easily matched in speech. They're about chunks of information, about lists, about labels. Regardless of the direction in which signs are written, continuous and non-continuous texts require different literacies, different skills, they have different intents and effects. Popular explanations tend to focus on material constraints. The materials used, the writing tools, the supports, and their material interactions are certainly key. Some directional movements are easier and smoother with a brush or pen on papyrus or parchment or a stylus through clay. But we need to be cautious here. Firstly, we should not assume that making things easy was necessarily a motivation in the ancient world. Secondly, we should not assume that everyone held their stylus like a pencil, which is a deliberately banal thing to say. And this was touched on already yesterday, but it is our default for holding a writing tool. And it constrains our thinking, particularly about push-pull movements. So how you hold your stylus or your brush, whether you change your grip during the course of writing, all affects the range of movements you can make. And this is where hands-on work is so important. If you discover that something is technically possible, but people in the past did not do it, that speaks to a choice. So somehow we need to hold on to all of these factors and probably more to make space for each to have its appropriate role in shaping writing practices and orthographies within a specific writing community. I would add in one more factor, and this is the stories, the justifications that writing communities find for explaining why they do things this way. And this is where we need to think about how handedness and writing direction shape our view of the environment. Left and right-handers assign positive or negative value to things differently. and this is reinforced by social convention. We make these associations and they are constantly reinforced as we interact with our environment. Everything is easier with your dominant hand and therefore more positive. Dominant is fluent and fluent is good. And for most people, dominant and that, this is the wrong hand, for most people, dominant and thus positive is right. And we have many examples of this cross-culturally. The right hand is the hand of God, the Lord Victor. The left hand is the unclean, the thieving hand, the hand of witchcraft or superstition. Writing direction itself shapes the spatialization of working memory, the direction in which arbitrary sequences of information are organized in memory. It drives preferences in the spatial features of objects, such as their location or direction. So people who read and write in a rightward direction have an aesthetic preference for faces in pictures to look rightward, for example. And it also determines the spatial axis that people use to depict time. Where is the past, behind or in front? Does time flow from the left or from the right? The more you participate in your writing practices, the more your skills are strengthened neurologically and physically, physiologically, and the more these social values are reinforced. And this, I think, is of particular relevance for instances of change in early writings. When you're developing a tool for a specific purpose, based on knowledge directly or indirectly acquired, but without a deep history of practice, you potentially have quite some freedom, not just in what form the script should take, how it relates to the language you speak, and what its rules should be, but also how to adjust it, how to fit the orthography so that it reflects and reinforces your values and vice versa. So I will finish off with three very high-level suggestions for understanding specific contexts of writing directionality in the achievement stage. The first thing to think about is fluid directionality as a deliberate choice, and one that is tied to materiality and meaning-making. I mentioned earlier that linear A is written on non-administrative objects. These are also the exception to the left-right directionality. So we have right to left, Brewster-Feeden, we've got spirals. We have one text which is part left to right and part right to left. Yeah. We can also discuss here the first Palace period seals, which have Cretan hieroglyphics. So the social significance of these sets of objects is different, but I'm grouping them together to suggest that the fluid directionality is intentional to invite handling of the object. Or perhaps the other way round, that because these things are meant to be handled, directionality can be whatever the maker and user want it to be. Our ritual devotional objects are themselves activated through handling, wearing on the body, carrying to the sanctuary and so on. And their manipulation to read the text could be a way of activating the power of the words. Prayers, formulae of dedication and so on, have in themselves their own patterns of movement. The multivalency and three-dimensionality of seals also demands interaction. Which face do you display when you wear the seal? Your view of the seal at your risk will be different to my view of it looking at you. And which face do you use to impress a ceiling? But that in itself produces a mirror image. And how do all of the motif elements combine to communicate the message you've chosen for your seal image? So this is an active, ongoing engagement with different modes of meaning making, which includes script, signs, images, symbols, meaning through display, and so on. And it requires that script signs can be used any way up to fit within an overall scheme. My instinct is that Cretan hieroglyphics started on seals. It inherited this sealness from the Akhanas script, and it was only later used on administrative documents. But the documents in their form retain this fluidity. They flip on strings, they hang on poles. They can be turned to show different information. Linear A administrative documents and all of Linear B, as I've said, are written left to right. Choices made by the developers of Linear A to lock that down for their administration, to reject Cretan hieroglyphic fluidity. And the Linear A writers who developed Linear B see no reason to amend this. So is there a relationship between directionality and information flow or information processing? We have a problem that it's unclear how Linear A administrative documents relate to each other and whether or not there's a hierarchy. But nevertheless, we can say that some tablets are more orderly than others and some show clearer categorization of information. But overall, the impression is of a torrent of unprocessed information flowing across lines, sometimes even across spaces, with tablets carrying text on recto and verso. If you add in the relative high frequency of palimpsests, suggesting tablets were erased and reused, this flow just kept coming and fast. So the tablet is a temporary resting place for information that is flowing across it. This contrasts with Linear B, where directionality now includes a kind of information processing. Information is separated out within the table-like structure, and this could suggest different modes of reading. Scanning of ideograms and numerals versus left to right reading of the text as a whole. Writing direction supports administrative activity here, and administrative activity drives writing direction. My final point, and the beginnings of an answer to the question, why left to right in Linear B? I suggest we start with a potential right as dominant and as fluent and as good ideology, but reframe it so that left-right writing directionality is one component of a much bigger concept of outside moving inwards. Goods and labour move from the hinterland into the palace. There's a line in the Tim Ingold sense that runs from the farmer in the field to the administrator in the palace, and along it moves things and information, the imposing of obligations, and the building of socio-political relationships. If we follow the proposal that the administrators are themselves members of the elite, then we can see this as one element of a deliberate shaping of the world. The lines are drawn inwards through the use of Linear B documents to reinforce the power and ideology of the elite. And that starts with the careful orientation of a field so that its own internal directionality references the string running through the ceiling. The curious things about the tablets is that they have very few references to where the agricultural and craft products end up once they're within the palace. So when the ideograms look off to the right, off the edge of the tablet, what are they looking at? And I would suggest here that they're looking at the activities in the palace, at the feasting, the ritual, the performances, the performativity performances of being elite, that this inward mobilization of resources has supported. Thank you for your attention.